Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another live episode of Basic Transfer Pricing Philippines. And tonight we will discuss to you the comparability analysis. No, this is a continuation of our previous live streaming on the OECD 2017 transfer pricing guidelines. No? I would like to say thank you to those who subscribe to our channel and to those who are supporting us and to our viewers, no, and also thank you to YouTube for this opportunity to share information with audience. So our topic will continue on the now on comparability analysis. In the previous, we have discussed about the arm's length principle, just a review, no? The arm's length principle deals with the comparability to put the related party transactions in their financial and commercial transactions at parity with the taxpayers on their independent parties, no? They are not related parties. Why? Because the arm's length principle will tell us that the true transaction is that of the independent party transactions because there is no element of control on the independent parties. While the related parties, there is an element of control. That's why the true transactions are not manifested in the dealings, no? Because of the element of control and the relationship between the parties. The independent parties transactions are influenced only by the market forces, while the related party transactions are influenced by the control or the relationship between parties. We have studied already the comparability factors under the arm's length principle, and what are those comparability factors that we are we have studied. The nature, characteristics of goods and services, of whether tangible or intangible, of goods and properties. And then we also have the functions, assets, and risks. We have the economic conditions, the contractual terms, and the business strategies. Those are the comparability factors. And we have learned also the transfer pricing methods, the 5 transfer pricing methods under this 2017 OECD transfer pricing guidelines. And what are those transfer pricing methods? We have the comparable and controlled price methods. We have the racial price method, cost plus methods, transactional net margin method, and the profit split methods. No? And then we study here in Chapter 3 the comparability analysis. Why comparability analysis? Because in the arm's length principle, if you try to analyze or try to look at the arm's length principle, the heart of the arm's length principle is comparability. Why? Because you have to compare the related parties transactions with that of the independent party transactions. Okay, since we are going to compare, then we have to look for comparables. Who are the companies that we are going to compare with the tested party or with the company under transfer pricing study? So our topic tonight is about foreign source or non-domestic comparables. Shout out, Tari.
Wala po pong shoutout nun pero may viewers po na 6.
Okay. So shout out tayo dun sa mga viewers po natin. Good evening po sa inyo ng lahat, and then thank you for watching, no? Kung may mga tanong po tayo about transfer pricing, especially dito sa mga bagong requirement po ng BAR, no, sa local po natin, sa local legislation po natin ngayon, especially yung BAR Form 1709 na dapat attach na doon sa annual income tax return po ng taxpayer with related party transactions, no? Ito yung tinatawag natin na documentation, transfer pricing documentation. So you have to attach yung mga contracts nyo, yung mga transfer pricing analysis study nyo, also the comparables. So, i-attach po natin yan sa annual income tax return. Kung napakarami siya at hindi kaya sa soft copy, you can scan the documents and then submit only the soft copy or the DVD-R, no? Or CDR. Pwede po, no? Pero you have to fill up the BIR Form 1709. Bakit? Because that will make the BIR basis for the transfer pricing audit, no? Mas madali na lang kasi nakasummarize na doon at may basis na yung BIR on the study of related party transactions, whether is subject kayo sa transfer pricing audit or not, no? So, our group of companies now should be ready with the transfer pricing audit, especially in the Philippines right now na there is already the transfer pricing audit guidelines, which is the RAMO 1-2019. And we have free, Hari, we have a free 2 days seminar on this transfer pricing audit guidelines in November and December. So in November, ano date natin? 16 and 17. And in December, 14 and 15. So dalawang dates po yan, no? That is free, provided magpe-register kayo. At ilan na yung nagpre-register sa atin as of now?
May 122 na po.
For November. Yung December wala pa.
Meron maaari ma.
Okay, so we have pre-registered participants. This is via YouTube on Basic Transfer Pricing Philippines. That is free. We have 120 participants for November. Nagpre-registered na po sila. And then we have 5 for December, no? So that is free. And you can post questions also. Pero ang ginagawa po natin kasi, since sa YouTube tayo, no? Parang webinar siya. Ang ginagawa natin, we don't entertain questions during the lecture, no? Pero ginagawa natin, halimbawa, 8 to 5 siya, we allot 1 hour, yung 4 to 5 to answer questions. That's why, kung may mga questions kayo, you just post in the comment portion of the YouTube, and then sasagutin po natin yung 1 hour na period, yung last hour po sa schedule natin, we will answer your questions para hindi naman ma-disturb yung ating lecture, because it might be that during the lecture, yung mga supposed to be questions nyo will already be discussed. Kaya doon tayo sa last part, mag-answer ng mga questions and queries. Yung mga discussions na talaga, at the last portion po, para may enough time tayo. At saka yung mga hindi na interesado doon sa questions, and then pwede na silang hindi na umattend, no? Okay. So, let's now go to comparables. Why comparables are necessary? Because you have to compare, no? So when you compare, you have your company that you are going to analyze, and then yung comparables mo, ito yung mga companies, independent companies, not related to your company, but same transaction with the company that you are having a transfer pricing study, so that as a basis kung to prove that the pricing of the company is arm's length, no? So foreign source or non-domestic comparables that can be used during the transfer pricing analysis, no? So sometimes taxpayers do not always perform searches for comparables on a country-by-country basis, no? Why? Especially if there are sufficient data, and sometimes the industry is very unique, no? And that you cannot find comparable in country where the company is operating. So where can you find the comparables? The foreign source or comparables in other countries. So in cases where there are insufficient data available at the domestic level, and or in order to reduce compliance cost, where several entities of an M&E group have comparable functional analysis. So kasi group yan ang nag-ooperate yan, group. At alam nyo naman pag grupo, no? Iba, whether you like it or not, no? Ako, I really have to accept the fact na whether we want the related party transactions to be at par with the independent party transactions, but the fact is they are really different, no? Why make them similar only for tax purposes? But sa totoong buhay, you cannot make them different. Why? Because the related party transactions, there is a relationship and they are under control, while the independent transactions, they are not under control by anybody. No? Okay, so non-domestic comparables should not be automatically rejected just because they are not domestic. No, sometimes the non-domestic or the foreign comparables should also be accepted. A determination of whether non-domestic comparables are reliable has to be made on a case-by-case basis and by reference to the extent to which they satisfy the 5 comparability factors. And what are those comparability factors that I discussed to you a while ago? They are the nature, characteristics of goods or services, whether tangible or intangible. There is that functions, assets, and risks, the contractual terms, the economic conditions, and the business strategies. So these 5 comparability factors are very important. That's why when you study transfer pricing, you have to memorize those 5 comparability factors. No? Whether or not one regional search for comparables can be reliably used for several subsidiaries of an M&A group operating in a given region of the world depends on the particular circumstances in which each of those subsidiaries operates. No? So even if they are owned, no, by the same group of companies, they are related parties, but you still have to look for that particular circumstances in each of those companies. Why? Kasi magkaiba yan, whether they are related or not, meron talaga yung differences, no? See paragraph 1.112 to 1.113 on market differences and multi-country analysis. Difficulties may also arise from differing accounting standards. No? So sometimes accounting standards are different, but there is what we call as international financial reporting standards, but I think there are still some countries who have not fully adopted the international financial reporting standards. That's why there are differences. And aside from that, even if they adopt the international financial reporting standards, the financial reporting standards have different standards, no? Just like in the international financial reporting standards, we have what we call as full IFRS, and we have this IFRS for small medium enterprise, and we have this accounting standards for small entities. No? So we have to adjust and reconcile for these accounting differences. Information undisclosed to taxpayers. What are these information undisclosed to taxpayers? These are information coming from source documents in the possession of the tax authorities, which are not available to the taxpayer or to the company. So tax administrators may have information available to them from examinations of other taxpayers or from other sources of information that may not be disclosed to the taxpayer. However, it would be unfair to apply a transfer pricing method on the basis of such data unless the tax administration was able, within the limits of its domestic confidentiality requirements, to disclose such data to the taxpayer so that there would be an adequate opportunity for the taxpayer to defend its own position and to safeguard effective judicial control by the courts. No? So, ano dapat kung meron kang information na hindi alam ng taxpayers, you have to disclose that information to the taxpayer as part of our due process. No? The due process is guaranteed by our constitution in the Philippines. No? So, as part of the due process, if the tax administration has data or information na comparable for the company, you have to disclose that to the taxpayer so that they can defend themselves, no? Hindi yung mabulagan na lang. That's part of the due process. Use of third party. Ito yung mga third galing VAT relief. Ito yung reconciliation of listing for enforcement. Ito yung sa national office, no, na yung mga taxpayers, na VAT registered taxpayers, they are required to submit a summary list of sales and purchases on a quarterly basis, no? Wala nang threshold. Dati kasi yung 2002 na revenue regulations, meron pang 1.5 million na sales sa quarterly na VAT sales, saka ka lang magbibigay ng VAT relief. Pagka 1 million yung purchases, saka ka lang magbigay ng VAT relief mo. Ngayon, hindi na. Basta VAT registered taxpayer ka, yung quarterly na VAT relief na report, kailangan information is being deposited sa warehouse po ng BAR that matches, no, that reconcile the reports of both the seller and the buyer. Kung yun ni-report ba na sales ng seller ay ni-report din ng purchaser, no? Minamatch yan. Kaya yun yung source ng third-party data po ng BAR. At aside from that, there is also what we call as tax reconciliation system po ng BAR. Ano naman yun? Make use of the information of the withholding agent. Di ba po ba meron tayong mga alpha list, no? That we are submitting end of the year, the annual alpha list of payes. Although ngayon, quarterly na sila, may list of payes na. And then, yung annual alpha list of compensation income earners, no, yung mga employees, no, may alpha list yan. Linalagay po yan sa isang data warehouse, kagaya ng VAT relief. And then, minamatch din yung data doon, no? So, ito bang winidholdan ang 2307 na may sales siya during the quarter of 3 million? Naka-report ba yan doon sa record niya? At ito namang nag-purchase ng 3 million na purchase, ni-report ba niya yan doon sa kanyang purchases din, no? Kasi magmamatch yan eh, no? So, dalawa po yung sources ng BIR on this third-party data, no? So, the transactional focus of transfer pricing methods and the question of a possible aggregation of the taxpayers' control transactions are discussed at paragraphs 3.9 to 3.12. No? So, a different question is whether non-transactional third-party data can provide reliable comparables for a taxpayer's control transaction or a set of transactions aggregated consistently with the guidance at paragraphs 3.9 to 3.12. No? Although yung sinasabi ko sa inyo na data sa BAR are always challenged in court, no? And in fact, there are cases na talaga hindi ino-honor ng court yung third-party data kasi nga daw hindi nag-examine yung examiner. If you try to look at yung mga cases that reaches the Supreme Court, sabi ko, napakababaw ng mga dahilan eh, na depende na lang yan sa defense, na idepensa naman yung stand ng BIR. Because these data are legitimate and they are signed by the penalties of perjury, and the taxpayer who reported that VAT relief signed it that their reports are true and correct. So, bakit sasabihin pa ng korte na hindi pwede? No, parang it's yung nag-commit ka na tama yung ginawa mo, tapos sasabihin ng korte na hindi tama. Parang para sa akin, it defies common sense, no? Kasi tama na yung lahat yung documentation na requirements and may close pa doon na sign under the penalties of perjury. So bakit sasabihin mo pa na hindi tama? Ano yung tama na hinahanap, no? So in practice, available third-party data are often aggregated data at a company-wide or segment level, no? Ang maalala ko, yung gusto pala ng korte doon sa sinasabi na bat relief na mga data doon, na dapat ay tiningnan pa rin ng examiner yung information, nag-audit pa rin siya, at tiningnan niya kung nandoon talaga yung resibo, nandoon ang ano. Sa bagay, para sa akin, tama din yun na ang examiner, as an examiner, talagang titingnan niya because that's part of the audit, no? So, siguro, dyan din may lapses yung examiner. Pagka gumawa ka ng audit, dapat tingnan mo talaga na nag-report siya ng summary list of sales and purchases. May supporting documents yan. At titingnan mo talaga yung supporting documents. Do not just rely on the certification. Why? Kasi audit ang pinag-uusapan dito eh. At pag sinabi nating audit, you have to look for those documents na in support of that certification, no? Okay. So, pero para sa akin, madali lang din i-comply. Why? As an auditor, requirements na taxpayer. Pag hindi, so pena mo, no? After na ma-contempt of court na siya, hindi siya naglagay, then you have to apply the Kuhan rule. And what is that Kuhan rule? Yung best evidence obtainable, no? At least may due process. Okay. Hindi yung pwedeng shortcut. So whether such non-transactional third-party data can provide reliable comparables for the taxpayer's controlled transaction or set of transactions aggregated consistently with the guidance at paragraphs 3.9 to 3.12 depends in particular on whether the third party performs a range of materially different transactions. Where segmented data are available, ito yung mga segmented data. Ano tong segmented data? Kailan ito natin i-discuss sa hari yung preparation ng segmented financial statement? Tapos na, no?
Tapos naman ng tax update.
So, wala na tayong discussion nito ulit?
Meron naman tayo naka-schedule sa ano.
Kailan?
14.
14?
Opo, ma'am.
So, kasama dyan yung preparation ng segmented financial statements. Okay.
Nabanggit niyo po, ma'am.
Okay, sige. So, i-discuss po natin yung preparation ng segmented financial statements or financial data, financial information, because that's one of the requirement of the RAMO 1-2019, yung Transfer Pricing Audit Guidelines po ng BAR. At kasama din doon yung supply chain analysis, no? Saan ba nag-umpisa yung supplies mo, na raw materials, sino yung sinusupplyan mo, until na nakarating yan doon sa end consumer. No? Yun yung supply chain analysis. Sa supply chain analysis, makikita mo kung saan dumadaan ng mga companies yung raw materials, yung mga goods to, bago makarating sa ultimate consumer. Okay, so segmented data are available. That's why ang sabi ko sa mga bookkeepers natin, prepare now the information or the data na meron na kayong information pag kinakailangan ng BIR yung segmented, no? Halimbawa, sabi niya segmented per branch. So dapat may sales and purchases na kayo at saka expenses per branch. Pag sinabi niya, bare line of product, dapat piniprepare nyo na yan ngayon in anticipation na later on, i-require po siya ng BIR. Otherwise, mahihirapan kayo if you are not preparing segmented reports. No? So, where segmented data are available, they can provide better comparables than company-wide non-segmented data. Pag non-segmented kasi, ang gulo, no? Very general. So, parang yung sinabi ko noon na yung case ng GlaxoSmithKline na napakarami nilang product, pero isa lang yung sinabi sa transfer pricing, yung Santac lang yung antacid nila. And ano yung ginamit doon? comparable and controlled price method. Isang product lang sa dami ng product nila, no? That's why be prepared with the segmented financial statements on a per product basis, no? Okay. So, where segmented data are available, they can provide better comparables than company-wide non-segmented data because of more transactional focus, although it is recognized that segmented data can raise issues in relation to the allocation of expenses to various segments, no? So, pwedeng mag-raise siya ng question on the allocation of expenses, no? Pero dapat meron tayong variables or meron tayong allocation basis. Similarly, company-wide third-party data may provide better comparables than third-party segmented data, no? In certain circumstances, such as where the activities reflected in the comparables correspond to the set of controlled transactions of the taxpayer. So, yung company-wide third-party data daw will provide better comparables than per third-party segmented data. So, depende sa circumstances. That's why, kahit na yung OECD are telling us na ang transfer pricing study talaga is depending on the facts and circumstances of the case. If you try to look at cases that reaches the Supreme Court, no, yung mga jurisprudence ng mga Supreme Courts in different parts of the world, different countries, may mga cases na nire-remand ulit, no? Kadating sa Supreme Court, nire-remand ulit sa tax courts for the factual investigation, no? Factual. Kaya nga, depending on the facts and circumstances of the case, no? At sino yung magdedetermine nun? Yung lower court. Hindi na po pwede yung Supreme Court ang mag-determine ng facts, no? Hindi niya hindi niya trabaho yun, no? Trabaho yun ng lower courts. Limitations in available comparables. The identification of potential comparables has to be made with the objective of finding the most reliable data, recognizing that they will not always be perfect, no? So wala talagang perfect na comparables, no? Kaya nagkakaroon tayo ng adjustment, comparability adjustment. After this comparability analysis, yung susunod na natin na topic is comparability adjustment. Why? Because after you have analyzed at makikita mo na hindi pa rin sila comparable, then you have to adjust. If the differences still exist after the comparability adjustment, then you have now the reason to reject that comparable. So, reject mo na, hindi siya pwede. Kasi hindi sila same, you're not placing the taxpayer at parity with the independent transactions, no? Yung related parties. Kaya, i-reject mo na yung comparables. If, after comparability analysis, you make a comparability adjustment and still, they are not comparable, they are not similar, then reject that comparable. Okay. So, for instance, independent transactions may be scarce in certain markets and industries. No? Kaya sabi natin may mga unique na transactions or unique na industries. Kaya wala kang makitang comparables. No? So a pragmatic solution may need to be found on a case-by-case basis. Case-by-case basis. Actually, ako pag gumagawa ako ng analysis, no, transfer pricing analysis, I suggested to clients na segmented. Ayoko yung lump sum na analysis na they have 5 functions tapos isang comparables lang gagamitin ko isa. No, I prefer na kung 5 functions yan, dapat bawat functions meron akong ginawang transfer pricing analysis per function, no? So ako ang ginagawa ko naman is segmented na transfer pricing analysis. That is very very specific, no? Yun yung style ko, that's my own style. Kasi ayoko yung 5 yung functions niya, tapos ilalam mo. Oh, so where can you find a comparable with the same activity with your client? Napakahirap. Pero kung i-per function mo, bawat functions, iba-iba yung comparables mo. No? Which is acceptable also because wala namang exact science ang transfer pricing. No? So, and that can be, you can defend it in court. pag nag-segmented transfer pricing analysis ka per functions. For instance, independent transactions may be scarce in certain markets and industries, no? O kaya wala talaga. A pragmatic solution may need to be found on a case-by-case basis, such as broadening the search. I-broaden mo pa, lawakan mo pa yung search mo. And using information on uncontrolled transactions taking place in the same industry and a comparable geographical market, no? So ano yung comparable geographical market natin? Siguro yung Southeast Asia, no? Comparable pa yung market natin, Philippines with Indonesia, with Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, no? Mayroon lang tayong mga adjustment na gagawin, no? Pero more or less comparable tayo, but not with Japan, with China, malayo tayo doon. No? So business models or other slightly different economic circumstances. Information on uncontrolled transactions taking place in the same industry but in other geographical markets, or information on uncontrolled transactions taking place in the same geographical market but in other industries. No? So pwede rin daw na same industry in geographical markets or same geographical market but different industry, no? Parang yung example dito sa 2017 transfer pricing guidelines na to, na yung resale price method, kinumpare nila yung manufacturer ng takore with the manufacturer of the blender or yung mga kitchen utensils, no? Kasi gross profit lang naman ang kinukompare, and then considering na pareho ng activity, so po pwede. Pero kung comparable uncontrolled price, hindi pwede yun. Why? Kasi kailangan pareho talaga ng product, no? The choice among these various options will depend on the facts and circumstances of the case. So sa transfer pricing, palagi nyo talaga maririnig itong facts and circumstances of the case. Will depend on the facts and circumstances of the case. Palagi yan, palagi talaga. Why? Kasi magkakaiba yung facts. Pag nagkaiba na yung facts, hindi mo na pwedeng i-apply, no? Yung mga jurisprudence, gaya nung mga nireview ko na transfer pricing cases. Tapos natutuwa naman ako dahil yung accountant, at the same time lawyer siguro, no? Pre-assessment pa lang, ang dami ng cases na pa-impress, no? Na isang disallowance pa lang, isang account, siguro may mga 5-10 na siyang cases na sinasite. Tinitingnan ko naman yung yung cases, inisa-isa ko. Diyos ko, hindi naman, ang layo naman sa facts and circumstances of the case. Kaya lahat ng cases na sinite niya, sinasabi ko not applicable in this case, no? Kunting pagkakaiba lang yan. Kaya nga, palagi mong sasabihin dito, depending on the facts and circumstances of the case. Pag nag-iba yung facts, nag-iba lang ng konti yung circumstances, hindi mo na pwedeng i-apply yung case. And in particular, on the significance of the expected effects of comparability defects on the reliability of the analysis. Kaya nga, sa sinasabi dito, reliability of the analysis, kailangan yung transfer pricing team mo composed of industry experts, composed of lawyers for the legal environment of the business, composed of accountants, no? Statistician to interpret the data, no? Industry experts. So kailangan nandyan yan sila so that you can make a good transfer pricing analysis report. A transactional profit split method might, in appropriate circumstances, be considered without comparable data. No, in some cases that resist the court, walang comparable data. Why? Kasi unique. But is there still transfer pricing issue? Is there still findings na sa transfer pricing? Yes, there is. There is still transfer pricing kahit wala siyang comparable data. No? where the absence of comparable data is due to the presence of unique and valuable intangibles contributed by each party to the transaction. See paragraph 2.115. However, even in cases where comparable data are scarce and imperfect, the selection of the most appropriate transfer pricing method should be consistent with the functional analysis of the parties. See paragraph 2.2. No? So ano tong functional analysis of the parties? Kasi pagka nag-compare ka ng resale price method, cost plus method, very particular ka on the functions, no? These are the factors that affect the resale price cost plus method. Yung functional analysis very important. Samantalang sa comparable and controlled price, ang factor doon na very important is the characteristic and nature of the goods or services. Kasi ang price very specific na yun sa product. Okay. May question na, Hari?
Wala po, ma'am. Wala po.
Shout out.
Wala rin po kami tinigang.
Oh?
Wala
Oh.
pong shoutout.
Ilan na yung viewers natin?
Viewers po, ma'am, na 11.
Okay. Sige. Selecting or rejecting potential comparables, no? There are basically two ways in which the identification of potentially comparable third-party transactions can be conducted, no? Ito yung comparable third-party transactions. I-compare natin, no? So, compare the third party. The first one, which can be qualified as the additive, no? Ito yung additive. Ako, I'm using the additive, yung the other one, no? Sa atin, Hari, di ba ang ginagawa natin? Halimbawa, meron tayong 400 companies, and then point of elimination na lang. So, hindi yun additive. Doon tayo sa isa, no? The first one, which can be qualified as the additive approach, consists of the person making the search drawing up a list of third parties that are believed to carry out potentially comparable transactions. So may listahan ka na. Then information is then collected on transactions conducted by these third parties to confirm whether they are in effect acceptable comparables. No, meron tayong listing. Hanap tayo doon ng comparables for the company na ginagawa ng transfer pricing analysis based on the predetermined comparable criteria. Ano yung predetermined comparable criteria? Usually functions, usually objective. Saan yan makikita? Doon sa Articles of Incorporation, doon sa objective, no, na bylaws, no? Articles of Incorporation, nandoon yon. So yun yung functions, dapat hindi lalayo doon. Otherwise, violation niya yon, no? This approach arguably gives well-focused results. All the transactions retained in the analysis are carried out by well-known players in the taxpayers market. Sometimes, ang suggestion natin dyan, yung comparables mo is your competitor, no? So, sino ba yung mga competitors mo in the market? Sila yung gawin mong comparable. As indicated above, in order to ensure a sufficient degree of objectivity, it is important that the process followed be transparent, systematic, and verifiable. So ano dapat daw? Transparent. Ibig sabihin na transparent, walang tinatago. Systematic, may sistema, may proseso, step by step, no? And verifiable. Ano yung ibig sabihin na verifiable? Can be authenticated, no? Bakit can be authenticated? In order to know the integrity of the document. Kaya dapat verifiable siya on the third party or on the source document. Okay, so the additive approach may be used as the sole approach where the person making the search has knowledge of a few third parties that are engaged in transactions that are comparable to the examined control transaction. It is worth noting that the additive approach presents similarities with the approach followed when identifying internal comparables. Also, in practice, an additive approach may encompass both internal and external comparables, no? So, ano yung internal and external comparables? We learned that sa previous na mga topics natin. Internal, ito yung may independent transactions, tapos may transactions yung group doon sa independent parties. No? Ito namang external comparables, wala talagang transactions yung group. External siya because they have the same functions, they have the same transactions, at i-compare mo itong group ng company under study, no? Under transfer pricing analysis study. So the second possibility, the deductive approach, starts with a wide set of companies that operate in the same sector. So yung additive list, no? Ito naman yung deductive, wide set of companies. Ito yung ginagawa namin, deductive, no? And then along the way, bawas ka na lang ng bawas. No, we start with mga 400 na companies, and then titingnan mo na ngayon, pag nag-differ na siya, eliminate mo na, no? Reject mo na kaagad. Hindi ka na yung undergo a thorough study on the company, reject mo na, lalo na iba yung functions niya. The second possibility, the deductive approach starts with a wide set of companies that operate in the same sector of activity, no? Saan ko yan nakikita? Bumibili ako ng data on the industry players, no? So perform similar broad functions and do not present economic characteristics that are obviously different. The list is then refined using selection criteria and publicly available information from databases, internet sites, information on known competitors of the taxpayer. In practice, the deductive approach typically starts with a search on a database, no? So, umpisa talaga siya sa database. It is therefore important to follow the guidance on internal comparables and on the sources of information on external comparables. See paragraph 3.24 to 3.39. So in addition, the deductive approach is not appropriate to all cases and all methods, and the discussion in this section should not be interpreted as affecting the criteria for selecting a transfer pricing method set out in paragraphs 2.1 to 2.12. So, na-observe ko, no, that even the OECD are very, very much careful in their wordings, no? So, ano sabi nila dito? Hindi mo daw masabi that deductive approach is not appropriate to all cases, no? And all methods, no? So, hindi mo interpret that it affects the criteria for selecting transfer pricing method. So, kasi sa deductive approach, ang gagamitin mo kasi dito, maghanap ka pa lang ng comparables, no? So, in practice, both quantitative and qualitative criteria are used to include or reject potential comparables. Examples of qualitative criteria are found in product portfolios and business strategies, no? So, yung qualitative, quality, no? So, that is pronoun, no? Qualitative. The most commonly observed quantitative criteria are, ito yung mga example ng quantitative criteria sa comparability, ha? Size criteria in terms of sales, assets, or number of employees, no? Ako, I usually use number of employees. The size of the transaction in absolute value or in proportion to the activities of the parties might affect the relative competitive positions of the buyer and seller, and therefore comparability, no? Because this criteria in terms of sales, assets, may ano yan eh, may effect yan sa comparability, no? You cannot compare a company with 1 billion sales with that of a company with 1 million sales, no? Kasi yung size nila magkaiba. Intangible related criteria such as ratio of net value of intangibles to total net assets value or ratio of research and development over sales were available. They may be used, for instance, to exclude companies with valuable intangibles or significant research and development activities when the tested party does not use valuable intangible assets nor participate in significant research and development activities, no? So, makikita mo, this intangible related criteria is very, very important and very significant in the comparability analysis. Why? Kasi magkaiba yung walang intangible at saka may intangible. No? Kasi yung may intangible, ano na kaagad yan sa kanila? Value added na kaagad yan sa kanila or competitive advantage na agad yan sa kanila. And you cannot compare yung may intangible na company with those na walang intangibles. Another criteria related to the importance of export sales. Foreign sales over total sales were relevant. So, yung company na may maraming export sales, hindi mo siya pwedeng i-compare doon sa companies na puro domestic sales lang. Magkaiba yan sila. Why? Because yung export sales, ang daming input VAT noon, no? Tax credit. So, that is already competitive advantage yan dito sa isa na puro local lang na wala siyang incentive on the input tax. No? Criteria related to inventories in absolute or relative value were relevant. No? So yung sa inventories. No? But for BIR purposes, ano lang yung allowed natin na valuation natin sa inventory? Cost lang. No? Kaya yung valuation natin, cost lang. Hindi natin tinatanggap yung lower of cost or net realizable value na nasa accounting standards. No? Other criteria to exclude third parties that are in particular special situations such as startup companies, bankrupted companies, and others when such peculiar situations are obviously not appropriate comparisons. No? So, other criteria. So, marami yan depending on the facts and circumstances of the case. The choice and application of selection criteria depends on the facts and circumstances of its particular case, and the above list is neither limitative nor prescriptive. So, maingat na naman ang OECD, no? So, hindi yan all-inclusive na list, no? Depending on the facts and circumstances of the case, no? And on the available information. So one advantage of the deductive approach is that it is more reproducible and transparent than the additive. It is also easier to verify because the review concentrates on the process and on the relevance of the selection criteria retained, no? Kasi just like us, no, halimbawa, we have 400 companies na napili. Dati magastos kasi binibili namin lahat yung, nireproduce namin lahat ng companies na 400. Ngayon, hindi na. No? We already analyzed those companies. Nire-reject na namin. Hindi na nire-reproduce kung hindi naman kailangan. No? On the other hand, it is acknowledged that the quality of the outcome of a deductive approach depends on the quality of the search tools on which it relies. Excuse me. So, ulitin ko lang ha. On the other hand, it is acknowledged that the quality of the outcome of a deductive approach depends on the quality of the search tools on which it relies. No? For instance, quality of the database where a database is used and possibility to obtain detailed enough information. This can be a practical limitation in some countries where the reliability and usefulness of databases in comparability analysis are questionable. No? So, yung countries na yung reliability, kailan naging question yung reliability and usefulness of databases? If the information are not accurate, no? And hindi updated, no? Yun yung isang constraint na nakikita ko in my gathering of information. Bawa, kumukuha ko ng data from the National Statistics Office, no? And then I am having an analysis of the 2019, 2018 na ano ng company, transfer pricing analysis report. So I want the economic conditions on the 2019. Yung available sa NSO natin na information, 2011 pa, 2013. So how can you apply that on the 2019? So yun yung reliability ng databases, no? That you can get in database, lalo na in the Philippines na database ng government. It would not be appropriate to give systematic preference to one approach over the other because depending on the circumstances of the case, there could be value in either the additive or the deductive approach. So depende daw yan, no? Sa additive or the deductive approach or in a combination of both. Para sa akin, it's the analyst, no, who will decide. The additive and deductive approaches are often not used exclusively. In a typical deductive approach, in addition to searching public databases, it is common to include third parties. For instance, known competitors, no? So ako talaga sinasama ko yung competitors. Or third parties that are known to carry out transactions potentially comparable to those of a taxpayer, no? Which may otherwise not be found following a purely deductive approach because they're classified under a different industry code. In such cases, the additive approach operates as a tool to refine a search that is based on a deductive approach, no? So, depende na yun sa analyst, no? So, walang preferred method. The process followed to identify potential comparables is one of the most critical aspects of the comparability analysis. That's why, and it should be transparent, no? So transparent should be known to both the taxpayer and the tax authority, systematic and verifiable, no? So we have discussed this already. Transparent, systematic, verifiable. So systematic, step by step, verifiable, no, can be authenticated, can be traced to the third-party information or to original information. In particular, the choice of selection criteria has a significant influence on the outcome of the analysis and should reflect the most meaningful economic characteristics of the transactions compared. So complete elimination of subjective judgments from the selection of comparables would not be feasible, but much can be done to increase objectivity and ensure transparency. So in the application of subjective judgments, no? Pag sinabi mong subjective judgment, kaya depende talaga yan sa analyst. So the analyst should be equipped with knowledge and information so that you can make a sound judgment, not just subjective judgments, no? Ensuring transparency of the process may depend on the extent to which the criteria used to select potential comparables are able to be disclosed and the reasons for excluding some of the potential comparables are able to be explained, no? So you explain some potential comparables, why they are not included, no? The reason for rejection. Increasing objectivity and ensuring transparency of the process may also depend on the extent to which the person reviewing the process, whether taxpayer or tax administration, has access to information regarding the process followed and to the same sources of data. Issues of documentation of the process of identifying comparables, no, are discussed in Chapter 5. Comparability adjustments, no? So after making a comparability analysis, then we have to make now the comparability adjustments. Why are we going to adjust and what and how to adjust, no? The need to adjust comparables and the requirement for accuracy and reliability are pointed out in these guidelines on several occasions, both for the general application of the arm's length principle and more specifically in the context of each method, no? Kaya nga, yung adjustment dun sa methods, dun sa arm's length principle, thoroughly discussed na po sila. Why? Kasi that's the heart of transfer pricing. To be comparable means that none of the differences, if any, so none of the differences between the situations being compared could materially affect the conditions being examined in the methodology, or that reasonably accurate adjustments can be made to eliminate the effect of any such differences. So why are you going to adjust? Because you want to eliminate the factor that materially affect the conditions being examined, no? You want to make them comparable. That's why you have to eliminate the one that materially affect the comparability. So whether comparability adjustments should be performed, and if so, what adjustments should be performed? So that's the question. So in a particular case is a matter of judgment that should be evaluated in light of the discussion of cost and compliance burden at section C. No? So ano yung i-adjust mo? So that's the most important job of the transfer pricing analyst. At yan din po yung the most important na job ng tax auditor. Why? Kasi during the adjustment, doon na siya makakakolekta. Doon na siya may findings, no? Because that comparability adjustment will now result to deficiency income tax, lalo na pag malaki, no? Material. Different types of comparability adjustment, no? So ito yung different types. Examples of comparability adjustment include adjustment for accounting consistency, isa na yun, designed to eliminate differences that may arise from differing accounting practices between the controlled and uncontrolled transactions, segmentation of financial data to eliminate significant non-comparable transactions, adjustments for differences in capital, functions, assets, and risks. No? So, yun. Yun yung mga adjustment na pwede mong gawin. No? Kasi, halimbawa, hindi sila pareho ng capital. So, you have to adjust for the difference in capital. No? Madali-dali yan. Pero yung mga geographic location or market na differences, mahirap i-adjust. No? An example of working capital adjustment is designed to reflect differing levels of accounts receivable, accounts payable, and inventory is provided in the annex to Chapter 3. No? So, we're now discussing the Chapter 3. The fact that such adjustments are found in practice does not mean that they should be performed on a routine or mandatory basis. Rather than the improvement to comparability should be shown when proposing these types of adjustment, as for any type of adjustment. No? Further, a significantly differing level of relative working capital between the controlled and uncontrolled parties may result in further investigation of the comparability characteristics of the potential comparable. No? So ito yung mga potential comparable na upon analysis, kailan mag-adjust, then we do the comparability adjustments. And what is the purpose of the comparability adjustments? To eliminate the differences that materially affect the comparables. Purpose of comparability adjustment should be considered if and only if they are expected to increase the reliability of the results. So kung ano yung reliability ng results na comparable, na similar yung comparables mo and the tested party or the company, no, and under transfer pricing analysis. Relevant considerations in this regard include the materiality of the difference for which an adjustment is being considered. No? So the quality of the data subject to adjustment, the purpose, no? Ayan na, quality of the data subject to adjustment. The purpose of the adjustment and the reliability of the approach used to make the adjustment. Kasi dito pumapasok talaga yung maraming issues, especially na pagdating sa adjustment, na hindi pa payag yung taxpayer, no? Kaya dito na yung sometimes nakakarating na sa court. Okay. So it bears emphasis that comparability adjustments are only appropriate for differences that will have a material effect on the comparison. No? Some differences will invariably exist between the taxpayer's control transactions and the third-party comparables. A comparison may be appropriate despite an unadjusted difference, provided that the difference does not have a material effect on the reliability of the comparison. Kasi, kung yung comparison na yun, yung hindi mo na siya i-adjust, hindi naman siya mag-affect dun sa reliability. No? Kaya hindi mo na kailangan mag-adjust. On the other hand, the need to perform numerous or substantial adjustment to K comparability factors may indicate that the third-party transactions are in fact not sufficiently comparable. Especially kung nag-adjust ka na, tapos hindi pa rin sila comparable. Adjust ka pa ulit, hindi na naman comparable. So, ano yung indicator niyan? You reject the comparable. Kasi hindi sila comparable, no? Hindi sila similar, hindi mo sila magawa na similar, no? It is not always the case that adjustments are warranted. For instance, an adjustment for differences in accounts receivable may not be particularly useful if major differences in accounting standards were also present. That could not be resolved, no? Kasi, di ba yung sabi natin na yung mag-a-adjust tayo pagka may difference in the treatment or in the accounting standards, no? Likewise, sophisticated adjustments are sometimes applied to create the false impression that the outcome of the comparable search is scientific, reliable, and accurate. So, you have to prove if you claim that it is scientifically, no? And sometimes it denotes false impression. And you claim, yung analyst natin, you claim na scientifically reliable and accurate. Sometimes, in that case, if it resists the court, then you have to defend your claim na it is scientific, reliable, and accurate, no? Kasi pagdating sa korte, talagang may deliberation, may trial. Reliability of the adjustment performed. It is not appropriate to view some comparability adjustments, such as for differences in levels of working capital, as routine and uncontroversial, and to view certain other adjustments, such as for country risk, as more subjective and therefore subject to additional requirements of proof and reliability. The only adjustments that should be made are those that are expected to improve comparability. Documenting and testing comparability adjustments. So are you going to document after you adjust, no? So how are you going to prove na tama yung ginawa mong comparability adjustment, especially now na the accountants are required to attach the BIR Form 1709 and it contains transfer pricing analysis. You have to present your comparables, no? So how are you going to document that your comparables are reliable, no? So ensuring the needed level of transparency of comparability adjustment may depend upon the availability of an explanation of any adjustments performed, no? Kung meron. The reasons for the adjustment being considered appropriate, how they were calculated, how they change the results for its comparable, and how the adjustment improves comparability. No? So issues regarding documentation of comparability adjustments are discussed in Chapter 5. No? So nandun na yung documentation. Actually, para sa akin, the hardest part ng transfer pricing are documentation. No? Kasi yung computation, you can compute it if there are available information. And saan yung source ng information na yan? From documentation. No? Even if you have the information but you don't have the documents, then you still cannot use those information. That's why documentations play a major role in transfer pricing. No? Okay. Arm's length range in general. In some cases, it will be possible to apply the arm's length principle to arrive at a single figure, price or margin. No, depende kung ano yung ginamit mo na factor. That is the most reliable to establish whether the conditions of a transaction are arm's length. However, because transfer pricing is not an exact science, so hindi siya exact science, there will also be many occasions when the application of the most appropriate method or methods produces a range of figures, all of which are relatively equally reliable. May range, no? So if you fall within the range, then reliable ka pa. In these cases, differences in the figures that comprise the range may be caused by the fact that in general, the application of the arm's length principle only produces an approximation of conditions that would have been established between independent enterprises. It is also possible that the different points in the range represent the fact that independent enterprises engaged in comparable transactions under comparable circumstances may not establish exactly the same price for the transaction. No? So kahit independent pa sila, hindi pareho yung kanilang pricing. That's why wala naman din talagang pareho, similar in all aspect, 100% na comparables. At most often talagang may variance. No? Pero if it falls within the range, acceptable pa rin. In some cases, not all comparable transactions examined will have a relatively equal degree of comparability, where it is possible to determine that some uncontrolled transactions have a lesser degree of comparability than others, they should be eliminated. No? So, dapat eliminate mo. It may also be the case that while every effort has been made to exclude points that have a lesser degree of comparability, what is arrived at is a range of figures for which it is considered, given the process used for selecting comparables and limitations in information available on comparables, that some comparability defects remain that cannot be identified and or quantified and are therefore not adjusted. No? So, kung may mga defect talaga na cannot be identified or you cannot quantify, so may defect talaga, hindi ka maka-adjust. In such cases, if the range includes a sizable number of observations, statistical tools that take account of central tendency to narrow the range, the interquartile range or other percentiles might help to enhance the reliability of the analysis. No? So para sa akin, trabaho na to ng statistician. No? Kaya nga dapat pag may team tayo, may statistician tayo kasama. A range of figures may also result when more than one method is applied to evaluate a controlled transaction. For example, two methods that attain similar degrees of comparability may be used to evaluate the arm's length character of a controlled transaction. Each method may produce an outcome or a range of outcomes that differs from the other because of differences in the nature of the methods and the data relevant to the application of a particular method used. Nevertheless, each separate range potentially could be used to define an acceptable range of arm's length figures. No? So data from these ranges could be useful for purposes of more accurately defining the arm's length range. No? So for example, when the ranges overlap, or for reconsidering the accuracy of the methods used when the ranges do not overlap. No general rule may be stated with respect to the use of ranges derived from the application of multiple methods, because the conclusions to be drawn from their use will depend on the relative reliability of the methods employed to determine the ranges and the quality of the information used in applying the different methods. No? So, walang general rule. Kahit na yung OECD will tell us, no? In the use of ranges. No? Kaya nga, depending on the facts and circumstances of the case, at saka kung acceptable siya, depende na din yan sa recommendation of the transfer pricing analyst. Where the application of the most appropriate method or in relevant circumstances of more than one method, see paragraph 2.12, produces a range of figures, a substantial deviation among points in that range may indicate that the data used in establishing some of the points may not be as reliable as the data used to establish the other points in the range, or that the deviation may result from features of the comparable data that require adjustments. No? So ano ba yung data that require adjustments? It will be shown in our comparability analysis. In such cases, further analysis of those points may be necessary to evaluate their suitability for inclusion in any arm's length range. No? So in our 5-day certificate program in transfer pricing, we will discuss, or we have example based on the explanation of the OECD, no? the one that I attended in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. We have some explanations there of the arm's length range that are acceptable. No? May mga sample tayo na computation. Dito kasi, ang binabasa ko sa inyo are the guidelines. No? So, kaya maingat ako pagdating sa guidelines. Hindi ako masyado nag-i-interpret. No? Tinatranslate ko lang sa saka yung mga example sa Tagalog, pero yung mga wordings, hindi po talaga ako nagbibigay ng opinion because regulations po ito, no? And my opinion is not walang basis yung opinion kung magbibigay ako. No? So, kaya ang dinidiscuss ko sa inyo is purely the regulations. Shout out?
Wala pong comments.
Wala ring comments. Ilan na yung ating
Viewers tayo na
8. Okay. Sige. So, selecting the most appropriate point in the range. If the relevant condition of the control transaction, price or margin is within the arm's length range, no adjustment should be made. Kung within the range siya, no? Sabi ng OECD kasi, 25 to 75 na range, nandyan, pasok pa yung halimbawa, gross margin mo, yung factor na ginamit na sa comparability, then acceptable pa. Pero yung may ibang mga laws or regulations, ang domestic tax authority, na meron na sila ang range, no? Pero sa atin wala. So, kaya we follow the OECD transfer pricing guidelines. If the relevant condition of the control transactions, price or margin, falls outside the arm's length range asserted by the tax administration, then the taxpayer should have the opportunity to present arguments, no? That the conditions of the control transaction satisfy the arm's length principle. That's why if you try to look at sa mga transfer pricing analysis report, nakalagay doon yung presentation and then may opinion yung analyst na anong opinion niya doon, that the pricing of goods and services between the related party transactions under analysis are arm's length, supported by documents. No? So, the arm's length range is different from the asserted by the tax administration. So, anong gagawin ng taxpayer? Mag-show siya ng proof na acceptable yung kanyang um, arm's length range. If the taxpayer is unable to establish this fact, the tax administration must determine the point within the arm's length range to which it will adjust the condition of the controlled transactions. In some cases, the tax administration would determine, but in some cases also, the taxpayers brought the case in court, no? Especially kung sobrang taas na nung adjustment ang ginagawa ng tax authority. And it requires a big amount of tax deficiency. In determining this point, where the range comprise results of relatively equal and high reliability, it could be argued that any point in the range satisfies the arm's length principle. No? So where comparability defects remain, as discussed at paragraph 3.57, it may be appropriate to use measures of central tendency to determine this point. For instance, the median, the mean, or weighted averages. No? So depending on the specific characteristics of the data set. No? In order to minimize the risk of error due to unknown or unquantifiable remaining comparability defects. No? So dapat pag gumawa tayo no, sa mga transfer pricing analyst natin, and for your information, meron tayong 2, and kung matuloy yung 3 this November, 5, and then pag mayroon pa tayong madagdag sa December, so madadagdagan pa sila. So far, we have certified 4, no? 4 transfer pricing analysts, and they're doing well. Okay, so it's 9:26. Now, 5 minutes break muna po, ha? Huwag mo na lang patayin, hari, kasi Okay. Okay, so let's go back to our discussions, and we will discuss about the extreme results on comparability considerations. No, so what are these extreme results that we're talking about? These extreme results are the comparability adjustments that we did. No, so extreme results might consist of losses. No, yung mga lugi, yun yung that's what triggers the CRA or the Canadian Revenue Agency to subject the GlaxoSmithKline in Canada to a transfer pricing audit, no, extreme losses. Or unusually high profits. Bakit sobrang taas ng profits? So extreme results can affect the financial indicators that are looked at in the chosen method. The gross margin when applying a resale price, or a net profit indicator when applying a transactional net margin method, depending on the method, no? Because there is a net the profit indicator, no? Or financial indicator. They can also affect the other items. Exceptional items which are below the line but nonetheless may reflect exceptional circumstances where one or more of the potential comparables have extreme results. Further examination would be needed to understand the reasons for such extreme results. The reason might be a defect in comparability or exceptional conditions met by an otherwise comparable third party. An extreme result may be excluded on the basis that a previously overlooked significant comparability defect has been brought to light, not on the sole basis that the results arising from the proposed comparable merely appear to be very different from the results observed in other proposed comparables. No? So, ito yung sinasabi nila na extreme results. It depends on the findings ng examiner. No? So, an independent enterprise would not continue. No? So ito naman yung reasoning ng tax authority or the OECD. Ano yung reasoning niya? The independent enterprise would not continue loss-generating activities unless it had reasonable expectation of future profits. Why? Because sabi nga natin, transfer pricing is economic taxation. And when we say economic taxation, what is the purpose of a business? The business is an economic entity. The purpose is profit, no? So why are you continuing a loss-generating activities? You are wasting your assets, no? It's against the purpose of the business as an economic entity to earn profits. No? Kasi net loss ka eh, bakit mo pa tinutuloy? See paragraphs 1.129 to 1.131. No? Simple or low-risk functions in particular are not expected to generate losses for a long period of time. So dapat, if you are losing, that is only temporary, or sometimes you're just making it as a strategy, no, to earn market share. So you are selling your goods or your services below cost, no, just a strategy, but that is just temporary. If it continues for a long time, then it is against a sound business practice, no, that the business is to earn profit. This does not mean, however, that loss-making transactions can never be comparable. In general, all relevant information should be used, and there should not be any overriding rule on the inclusion or exclusion of loss-making comparables. So it depends on the analyst. That's why when we are training this the certificate program in transfer pricing for potential transfer pricing analysts, talagang we have to be to prepare them to be critical, no, in their analysis and in their knowledge. Why? because even a loss-making comparables can be used, no? So depende na yan sa analyst to justify. So indeed, it is the facts and circumstances surrounding the company in question that should determine its status as a comparable, not its financial result, no? Kaya depende na yan sa transfer pricing analyst, and during the transfer pricing audit guide na gagawin ng tax authority. So kung nandiyan na yung examiner and then questioning about the result of the operation or the financial result, and then the transfer pricing analyst can answer and justify, then sufficient yung explanation, walang deficiency na i-assess yung examiner. So generally speaking, a loss-making uncontrolled transaction should trigger further investigation in order to establish whether or not it can be a comparable. So further investigation. Circumstances in which loss-making transactions or enterprises should be excluded from the list of comparables include cases where losses do not reflect normal business conditions. So exclude mo yan. Halimbawa, kagaya ngayon, hindi normal dahil may pandemic. So this is not normal business conditions. You want to choose it as a comparable. And where the losses incurred by third parties reflect a level of risk that is not comparable to the one assumed by the taxpayer in its controlled transactions. So loss-making comparables that satisfy the comparability analysis should not, however, be rejected on the sole basis that they suffer losses, no? Okay, so pwede pa rin silang isama as comparable. A similar investigation should be undertaken for potential comparables returning abnormally large profits relative to other potential comparables. So, yung iba naman sobra-sobra yung profit, they can also be a potential comparable. So, you have to adjust or analyze, no? So, if potentially comparable adjustment can be made to make them similar, then pwede pa rin silang comparables. Okay, another is the timing issues in comparability. There are timing issues in comparability with respect to the time of origin, collection, and production of information on comparability factors and comparable uncontrolled transactions that are used in comparability analysis, no? Mga timing issues. See paragraph 5.27 and 5.36 of Chapter 5 for indications with respect to timing issues in the context of transfer pricing documentation requirements, no? Sa malala ko yung mga anong tawag dito, yung mga na letter notice, no? Yung pinapareconcile yung kanilang VAT relief, no? Because hindi magtatali, karamihan ng justification are timing issues, no? So timing of origin. In principle, information relating to the conditions of comparable uncontrolled transactions undertaken or carried out during the same period of time as the controlled transaction, contemporaneous uncontrolled transactions is expected to be the most reliable information to use in a comparability analysis, no? Because it reflects how independent parties have behaved in an economic environment that is the same as the economic environment of the taxpayer's controlled transaction, no? So, contemporaneous sila sa economic environment. Availability of information on contemporaneous uncontrolled transactions may, however, be limited in practice depending on the timing of collection. Kaya dapat, if you are a transfer pricing analyst, dapat talaga nagko-compile ka ng mga economic information, no? Talagang gastusan mo din talaga, magde-data warehousing ka. Timing of collection. In some cases, taxpayers establish transfer pricing documentation to demonstrate that they have made reasonable efforts to comply with the arm's length principle at the time their intragroup transactions were undertaken, no? On an ex-ante basis, after the arm's length price setting approach, no? Ex-ante before, based on information that was reasonably available to them at that point, no? Such information includes not only information on comparable transactions from previous years, but also information on economic and market changes that may have occurred between those previous years and the year of the controlled transaction. No? So in effect, independent parties in comparable circumstances would not base their pricing decision on historical data alone. In other instances, taxpayers might test the actual outcome of their controlled transactions to demonstrate that the conditions of these transactions were consistent with the arm's length principle on an ex post basis. Hereinafter, the arm's length outcome testing approach. No? Such test typically takes part as part of the process for establishing the tax return at year end. Both the arm's length price setting and the arm's length outcome testing approaches, as well as combination of these two approaches, are found among OECD member countries. No, the Philippines is not an OECD member country, no, but as a matter of principle, we adhere to the OECD transfer pricing guidelines. The issue of double taxation may arise where a controlled transaction takes place between two associated enterprises where different approaches have been applied and led to different outcomes. For instance, because of a discrepancy between market expectations taken into account in the arm's length price setting approach and actual outcomes observed in the arm's length outcome testing approach, see paragraphs 4.38 and 4.39. Competent authorities are encouraged to use their best efforts to resolve any double taxation issues that may arise from different country approaches to year-end adjustment, and that may be submitted to them under a mutual agreement procedure. So yan yung Article 25 of the OECD Model Tax Convention. Valuation highly uncertain at the outset and unpredictable events. The question arises whether, and if so, how to take account in the transfer pricing analysis of future events that were unpredictable at the time of the testing of a controlled transaction. So in particular, where valuation at that time was highly uncertain, no? So highly uncertain. So you don't know at the time that you make the transfer pricing analysis. So the question should be resolved both by the taxpayers and tax administrations by reference to what independent enterprises would have done in comparable circumstances to take account of the valuation of uncertainty in the pricing of the transaction, because it never happened yet, no? And if the party fails to recognize it, then how will the tax authority and the taxpayer will resolve that issues, no? When that uncertain thing happen. The reasoning that is found at paragraph 6.181 to 6.185, which provide guidance on the arm's length pricing of transactions involving intangibles for which valuation is highly uncertain at the time of the transactions, no? So highly uncertain at the time of the transactions, hindi pa alam. Applies by analogy to other types of transactions with valuation uncertainties. Ano to mga valuation uncertainties? Karamihan, ito yung mga intangibles, no? So the main question is to determine whether the valuation was sufficiently uncertain at the outset that the parties at arm's length would have required a price adjustment mechanism, or whether the change in value was so fundamental a development that it would have led to a renegotiation of the transaction. Where this is the case, the tax administration would be justified in determining the arm's length price for the transaction on the basis of the adjustment clause or renegotiation that would be provided at arm's length in a comparable and controlled transaction. In other circumstances where there is no reason to consider that the valuation was sufficiently uncertain at the outset that the parties would have required a price adjustment clause or would have renegotiated the terms of the agreement. There is no reason for tax administrations to make such an adjustment, as it would represent an inappropriate use of hindsight. No? So the mere existence of uncertainty should not require an ex post adjustment without a consideration of what independent enterprises would have done or agreed between them. So if these things happen, no, there are uncertainties, you have to consult also, applying the principle of arm's length, what the independent parties will be doing if these circumstances happen, no? So yun ang arm's length principle eh. So you have to consult the independent parties' treatment of the kind of transaction, especially if the uncertainties happen. So data from years following the year of the transaction. Data from years following the year of the transaction may also be relevant to the analysis of transfer prices, but care must be taken to avoid the use of hindsight. No? So for example, data from later years may be useful in comparing product life cycles of controlled and uncontrolled transactions for the purpose of determining whether the uncontrolled transaction is an appropriate comparable to use in applying a particular method. So very careful, because that is the use of hindsight, no? Past event. The conduct of the parties in years following the transaction will also be relevant in accurately delineating the actual transactions, no? So yung years following the year of the transaction, so ibig sabihin nangyari na, no? How can they relate to the study? Multiple year data. In practice, examining multiple year data is often useful in comparability analysis, but it is not a systematic requirement, especially in the Philippines, na yung requirement natin dito for tax audit is on a one taxable year basis, no? So pag naggamit ka ng multiple year data, pagdating na ng examination, yung current year lang gagamitin, hindi niya gagamitin yung mga prior years, no? Why? Because the transfer pricing audit is not a separate audit. It is included in the regular audit, no? So pag may related party transactions, then the examiner will now demand transfer pricing documentation in accordance with the letter of authority issued to him or her to audit on a regular basis. So kasama lang doon ang transfer pricing audit. Multiple year data should be used where they add value to the transfer pricing analysis. It would not be appropriate to set prescriptive guidance as to the number of years to be covered by multiple year analysis. So wala po talagang guidance on multiple years analysis, no? So in order to obtain a complete understanding of the facts and circumstances surrounding the controlled transaction, it generally might be useful to examine data from both the year under examination and prior years. Siguro for the sake of the trend, no, pwede mong i-consult yung prior years. And sa Pilipinas naman, in our country, we require a comparable financial statement. That's why we know the previous year, no, the immediately past year under investigation. The analysis of such information might disclose facts that may have influenced or should have influenced the determination of the transfer price. So for example, the use of data from past years will show whether a taxpayer's reported loss on a transaction is part of a history of losses on similar transactions. The result of particular economic conditions in a prior year that increased cost in the subsequent year, or a reflection of the fact that a product is at the end of its life cycle. Such an analysis may be particularly useful where a transactional profit method is applied. See paragraph 1.131 on the usefulness of multiple year data in examining loss situations. Multiple year data can also improve the understanding of long-term arrangements, especially if in the process of comparability, there is that contractual terms, no? That the effectivity is 10 years, no? So you can revisit the previous years. Multiple year data will also be useful in providing information about the relevant business and product life cycles of the comparables. Itong product life cycles ng comparables, especially sa pharmaceutical companies, especially if what you are comparing is the product, and then the product is under the patent, no, in the IPO, that life cycle of the product is 20 years, because after 20 years it will become off patent. No? So differences in business or product life cycles may have a material effect on transfer pricing conditions that needs to be assessed in determining comparability, no? Kasi if the product life cycles is descending, no, hindi na kumikita as compared nung bagong launch pa lang yung product. The data from earlier years may show whether the independent enterprise engaged in a comparable transaction was affected by comparable economic conditions in a comparable manner, or whether different conditions in an earlier year materially affected its price or profit, so that it should not be used as comparable. So, the transfer pricing analyst will determine, no, kung gagamitin pa niya na comparable or not. Multiple year data can also improve the process of selecting third-party comparables by identifying results that may indicate a significant variance from the underlying comparability characteristics of the control transaction being reviewed, no? In some cases leading to the rejection of the comparable or to detect anomalies in third-party information. No? During the transfer pricing audit, you can discover so many information about the business. The use of multiple year data does not necessarily imply the use of multiple year averages. Multiple year data and averages can, however, be used in some circumstances to improve reliability of the range. No? So see paragraphs 3.57 to 3.62 for a discussion of statistical tools. No? Compliance issues. Compliance are very important, no? In tax matters, compliance are very important. One question that arises when putting the need for comparability analysis into perspective is the extent of the burden and cost that should be borne by a taxpayer to identify possible comparables and obtain detailed information thereon. It is recognized that the cost of information can be a real concern, especially for small to medium-sized operations, but also for those M&Es that deal with a very large number of control transactions in many countries. Paragraph 4.28 and Chapter 5 contain explicit recognition of the need for a reasonable application of the requirement to document comparability. No? So very important. No? So when I studied transfer pricing, OECD tells us or told us that please tell your taxpayers, please tell your clients to invest in documentation. When undertaking a comparability analysis, there is no requirement for an exhaustive search of all possible relevant sources of information. Taxpayers and tax administration should exercise judgment to determine whether particular comparables are reliable. No? So it depends on the skills, knowledge, wisdom of the transfer pricing analyst. No? It is a good practice for taxpayers to set up a process to establish, monitor, and review their transfer prices, taking into account the size of the transactions, their complexity, level of risk involved, and whether they are performed in a stable or changing environment. So it's the taxpayer itself who will review or set up the process, no? or adopt policies, no? to see to it that their transfer prices are arm's length so that they will not have problems later on. Okay. Such a practical approach would conform to a pragmatic risk assessment strategy. No? So the taxpayer will assess itself, no, for risk in transfer pricing audit. Or prudent business management principle. In practice, this means that it may be reasonable for a taxpayer to devote relatively less effort to finding information on comparables supporting less significant or less material controlled transactions. For simple transactions that are carried out in a stable environment and the characteristics of which remain the same or similar, a detailed comparability, including functional analysis, may not be needed every year. So it depends, no? If the operation is stable, there's no material differences or no major changes in the operation, then comparability analysis may not be needed every year. But for me, since it's in the Philippines and it's on a one taxable year basis, then maybe the preparation of transfer pricing analysis should be done also on an annual basis. Small to medium-sized enterprises are entering into the area of transfer pricing, and the number of cross-border transactions is ever increasing. That's why there is a need for a transfer pricing analysis. Although the arm's length principle applies equally to small and medium-sized enterprises and transactions, pragmatic solutions may be appropriate in order to make it possible to find a reasonable response to its transfer pricing cases. No? So, usually kasi yung transfer pricing analysis, transfer pricing study, ginagawa lang ng mga malalaking multinational enterprises. Yung mga small and medium, maliliit lang kami, hindi na kami masasubject. But right now, doon sa requirement ng BAR, sa BAR Form 1709, no matter how small, even if you don't have a transaction but you have a related party, you still have to disclose, no? Even if you don't have any transaction with each other. Okay? So, that's all for the comparability analysis, no? So, we start with the chapter 4, no? Which is the administrative approaches to avoiding and resolving transfer pricing disputes, and how this OECD, no, deals about this transfer pricing disputes. For some organization or international organizations, the disputes are done voluntarily, no, yung mga voluntary arbitration, no, we're fond of that, and even our courts recognize the importance of voluntary arbitration, no, yung mag-a-agree na muna yung both parties before bringing the case to court para mas mabilis, no? So, in the introduction, the chapter examines various administrative procedures that could be applied to minimize transfer pricing disputes and to help resolve them when they do arise between taxpayers and their tax administrations and between different tax administrations. These are the parties on transfer pricing disputes, no? Yung country ng taxpayer, the tax authority of the country where the taxpayer is operating, and then the country of the related parties, no, where the related parties are also doing their business activities. Such disputes may arise even though the guidance in these guidelines is followed in a conscientious effort to apply the arm's length principle, no? So even if you follow the guidelines, the guidance, the OECD transfer pricing guidance, there can be a dispute that will arise, no? So it is possible that taxpayers and tax administrations may reach differing determinations of the arm's length conditions for the controlled transactions under examination, given the complexity of some transfer pricing issues and the difficulties in interpreting and evaluating the circumstances of individual cases. May nanonood pa sa atin, Hari?
Meron ma'am. 6
Okay.
viewers.
Hindi bale. Anyway, yung viewers na yan, madagdagan naman yan pagka ano pa sila eh. Kasi pwede naman nilang i-rewind, no? Where two or more tax administrations take different positions in determining arm's length conditions, double taxation may occur, no? Pagka different positions yung there is double taxation. Why? Because the party already paid in the country of origin, and when the transfer pricing adjustment during transfer pricing audit happened, bayad na yung tax that pertains to the profit that should be allocated in the other country. So bayad na doon sa other country. So double taxation means the inclusion of the same income in the tax base by more than one tax administration. So when either the income is in the hands of different taxpayers, there is economic double taxation for associated enterprises. So, or the income is in the hands of the same juridical entity, juridical double taxation for permanent establishments. So double taxation is undesirable and should be eliminated whenever possible. So yung salita dito na whenever possible. So talagang i-avoid. But there are instances where double taxation cannot be avoided, especially if it is intentional on the part of one of the parties, of the related parties, to shift the profit, no? Hindi niya ibibigay dito sa party where that the income should be low, no? So may double taxation na mangyayari. Double taxation is undesirable and should be eliminated whenever possible because it constitutes a potential barrier to the development of international trade and investment flows. So it should be discouraged. Kasi ayaw ng mga enterprises ng double taxation because it is very costly on their part, no? Kung pinaghirapan nila, mapunta na lang lahat sa tax. Wala na matitira. The double inclusion of income in the tax base of more than one jurisdiction does not always mean that the income will actually be taxed twice, especially if the income in the other country is not taxable, or there is a very low interest rate or no tax at all. This chapter discusses several administrative approaches to resolving disputes caused by transfer pricing adjustments and for avoiding double taxation. Because if we try to look at the steps that we are discussing, we started with the arm's length principle, and then the comparability factors, the transfer pricing methods, the comparability analysis, the adjustments. After you make the adjustments and then the taxpayer is not amenable, then the tax authority should know how to administer and how to resolve the disputes, no? So ito yung mga protested na ng taxpayer, no? Ayaw pumayag dun sa adjustment. So Section B discuss transfer pricing compliance practices by tax administrations, in particular examination practices, the burden of proof and penalties. Section C discusses corresponding adjustments. Paragraph 2 of the Article 9 of the OECD Model Tax Convention and the Mutual Agreement Procedure, Article 25. Section D describes the use of simultaneous tax examination by two or more tax administrations to expedite the identification, processing and resolution of transfer pricing issues and other international tax issues. Section E and F describe some possibilities for minimizing transfer pricing disputes between taxpayers and their tax administrations, no? That's why is it that voluntary arbitration is encouraged? Because it is very costly to go to court. You can just imagine the deliberation, the trial, the presentation of documents that will be done on during the trial of the case, no? So it's very costly to the taxpayers. both to the taxpayer and to the tax authority. Section E addresses the possibility of developing safe harbors, no, for certain taxpayers. Ano yung safe harbors? Yung hindi na sila ma-audit ng transfer pricing. And Section F deals with advanced pricing arrangement. Advanced pricing arrangements is just like asking for an advance ruling, no, that your pricing is correct, which address the possibility of determining in advance transfer pricing methodology or conditions for the taxpayer to apply to specified control transactions. Section G considers briefly the use of arbitration procedures to resolve transfer pricing disputes between countries. No? Transfer pricing compliance practices. Tax compliance practices are developed and implemented in its member country according to its own domestic legislation and administrative procedures. So in the Philippines, I will have a video on the transfer pricing laws, rules, and regulations that is followed here or applied here in the Philippines. No, I just finished my PowerPoint. No, so hopefully we can record it, have a video on those topics, and we can post it next week, no, to make it available in YouTube. So many domestic tax compliance practices have three main elements. A, to reduce opportunities for non-compliance through withholding taxes and information reporting. Why withholding taxes is a very effective mode of collecting taxes? Because the withholding agent designated by the government holds the money. No? So before giving the money to the recipient, withhold the tax and remit it to the government. No? And information reporting. Letter B, to provide positive assistance for compliance. No? So assistance for those who want to comply through education and published guidance. No? For me, very important yung information, because even if you want to comply but you lack the information, that's why you have a poor compliance. And C, to provide these incentives for non-compliance as a matter of domestic sovereignty and to accommodate the particularities of widely varying tax systems. Tax compliance practices remain within the province of each country. Nevertheless, a fair application of the arm's length principle requires clear procedural rules to ensure adequate protection of the taxpayer and to make sure that the tax revenue is not shifted to countries with overly harsh procedural rules. No? Why is it that there is a tax haven countries? Because they have a very less tax, very low tax, or no tax at all. However, when a taxpayer under examination in one country is a member of an M&A group, it is possible that the domestic tax compliance practices in a country examining a taxpayer will have consequences in other tax jurisdictions. This may be particularly the case when cross-border transfer pricing issues are involved, because the transfer pricing has implications for the tax collected in the tax jurisdictions of the associated enterprises involved in the controlled transaction. If the same transfer pricing is not accepted in the other tax jurisdictions, the M&A group may be subject to double taxation as explained in paragraph 4.2. And we want to avoid double taxation, no? So thus, the tax administration should be conscious of the arm's length principle when applying their domestic compliance practices and the potential implications of their transfer pricing compliance rules for other tax jurisdictions, and seek to facilitate both the equitable allocation of taxes between jurisdictions and the prevention of double taxation for taxpayers. No? So this section describes three aspects of transfer pricing compliance that should receive special consideration to help tax jurisdictions administer their transfer pricing rules in a manner that is fair to taxpayers and other jurisdictions. No? So, the OECD transfer pricing guidelines is designed both for the taxpayer and the tax administrations. So, while other tax law compliance practices are in common use in OECD member countries, for example, the use of litigation and evidentiary sanctions where information may be sought by a tax administration but is not provided, these three aspects will often impact on how tax administrations and other jurisdictions approach the mutual agreement procedure process and determine their administrative response to ensuring compliance with their own transfer pricing rules. No? So in some countries, there are many countries now who has a very good transfer pricing law. The three aspects are examination practices. No? Kaya nga sa Philippines ngayon, meron ng transfer pricing audit guidelines. No? So the examination practices, the burden of proof, no? So nandoon yung mga sa transfer pricing guidelines, which is the RAMO 1-2019 here in the Philippines, there is already the requirements of the documentation, no? And that burden of proof always lies with the taxpayers and the penalty system, no? So the penalty system follows the violations committed by the taxpayer as embodied in the National Internal Revenue Code. The evaluation of these three aspects will necessarily differ depending on the characteristics of the tax system involved. And so, it is not possible to describe a uniform set of principles or issues that will be relevant in all cases. Instead, this section seeks to provide general guidance on the types of problems that may arise and reasonable approaches for achieving a balance of the interest of the taxpayers and the tax administrations involved in a transfer pricing inquiry. So, bakit balance? To be fair, no? To be fair with both. That's why this OECD transfer pricing guidelines, as I told you, is designed for both the taxpayer and the tax administration, no? Para fair to both of them, so that the taxpayers will be audited, transfer pricing audit, subjected to transfer pricing audit, also know the rules and principles that should be followed to observe the due process requirement of our Constitution. No? So for these examination practices and other topics, we will continue next, no? So next week, meron tayo ulit na live streaming. We will continue with this. Although, sabi ko sa inyo, I just made so many topics na i-video natin all about transfer pricing. No? So, I have made the arm's length principle, the 5 comparability factors, the 5 transfer pricing methods, yung mga basic na information that we need about the transfer pricing, I try to address them. No? So, walang shout out. Okay, so walang question. So let's call it a night. And thank you for watching. And please continue to support us in our YouTube channel. And we promise to bring you more updates, especially in transfer pricing in the Philippines. Thank you and good evening.